We will be going live in just under 5 minutes. We will be going live in just about 2 minutes. Good evening and welcome to the ARK-aeology Files, episode 2. We're so glad that you could join us this evening, or if you're watching later, as you know, throughout the week you get time to join us. We're going to bow our heads real quick for a moment of prayer before we begin our program for tonight. Dear Lord, please be with us as we close out this week and we begin afresh. Keep our minds and hearts on you and help us to be open to listening to your word and the evidence that we can find all around us, showing that the Bible is true and evidence of you. In your name we pray, amen. So, if you didn't join us last week, I just want to give a recap over what we covered. So, first thing that we covered was an intro to who Noah actually was. Noah was the 10th generation from Adam, and when the flood occurred, on the time scale of where we are now compared to creation, we know that the flood occurred sometime around the year 2300 BC. And then we looked at a timeline of just the various mythologies and legends that are surrounding the flood and what those vessels may have looked like based on the descriptions that we're reading and some of the tablets and scrolls and mythologies that have been passed down. And then we moved into the general location of where Ararat was located. We determined that it was a mountainous region that was in eastern Turkey and in Armenia, between two different lakes and a river, and that was the ancient region of Ararat. We then went over the notable expeditions that were searching for Noah's Ark and turned our focus to the location of a discovery in the 1950s by Captain Durupınar. Now, what I didn't show you last week was the actual original image that came out in 1956 that Captain Durupınar was looking at, and that would be the image that we are seeing on our screens now. He was reviewing this aerial footage, and in the middle of the screens, you will see this red circle, and this red circle contains the object that is in question. The compass rose here has us pointing which direction is north, which is south. This object in question is located not more than 19, just over 18 miles as the crow flies, almost directly south of what people consider the Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark landed. But we know from our studies last week that Ararat wasn't a specific mountain, but a region. And so if we're looking in this region, we can look at these pictures that emerged in the 1950s right down here at the southern end of the screen, and we're going to continue on down to get a better satellite view. This is that U-shaped mountain. If you look at the top of the screen underneath the word Doomsday, this is that U-shaped mountain that is mentioned in some of the traditions that come out of France. We do know that there was at some point a mountain, whether it was volcanic or not is disputed, but we do know that at some point within the past 3,000 to 4,000 years that this mountain was subjected to a meltdown, and the mountain itself had a landslide that poured down through the valley. Now, there was nowhere for all of the soil from this mountain to go except for a small break right in this general vicinity here. And then the landslide went through this small little bottleneck and down into the fields near Tel Decker. And this location I'm going to highlight for you where the landslide matter originated. It slid through this bottleneck right here in the center of your screens and then down into the valley. And it's within this bottleneck that the captain discovered this object in question. And this is an actual photo instead of satellite imagery from that general vicinity during, I believe that this picture was taken during the springtime. More recently showing what this area now looks like. And you can see some of the remnants of the landslide in these heaps along this area right here in the center part of your screen. Now, here is another overhead view of the object in question. And then this is going to be video footage from the area. I thought you might like a 3D overview. Last week we had talked about fault lines in an earthquake. This is one of the fault lines that was exposed. This area here on the right side of the screen, that's where one of the fault lines was exposed. And you can see this is the general object. This area in the upper left here is where the expedition went in the 1959s. And that is where they blew the hole in the side of the object in question. That was their archaeological expedition. But as you're looking towards the north now, that would have been where you would see, let me just rewind that video, Mount Ararat itself, Greater Ararat, would have been right up here at the upper left portion of your screen, and off to the right side, more the rightish central area vicinity here, that's Ararat Lesser. So that's some information that if you hadn't been with us last week, you didn't get to see this. And if you were with us last week, there was some new information there for you. We also covered, would we be able to find remnants of wooden vessels after so many years? And the answer is yes. We covered some of the ships that were available to be viewed. And one of those is the Sea of Galilee boat that's about 2,000 years ago, around the time of Christ or shortly thereafter. We talked about the Sutton Hoo ship. This one is from the 600s AD, and we're going to be looking at this a little bit more today. And that is where we stopped for the day. So we're going to move into some new materials, and I'm always excited to answer questions as they come through. So please don't hesitate to go ahead and send those questions through. We can stop and answer them along the way. Love that interaction. So if you do have questions, don't be shy. Chances are somebody else has the same question. So let's move into where we left off last week, which was the measurements for Noah's Ark. So when we're looking at the measurements, the first thing that we want to note is measurements in the Bible were not given in feet and inches and centimeters and meters. They were given using something that is known as a cubit. And if we go back to who originally is writing about Noah's Ark, the person that was originally writing about Noah's Ark is Moses. And Moses was not trained in any Hebrew school. Moses was actually trained by the Egyptians because he was one of the individuals that had been considered to be one of the future leaders of Egypt. So Moses learned all of the knowledge of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds according to Acts 7:22. The Israelites at the time of Moses, as they were working, they also would have been using the Egyptian cubit. Now, I say the Egyptian cubit because there are multiple different types of cubits, which we'll get into in a moment. But the biggest question is, do we have any records of what the Egyptian cubit was? Yes, we do. What you're looking at on your screen is an example of an Egyptian cubit. This is called the Ruler of Maya. It was found in Memphis, Egypt. And if you don't know, Memphis was also referred to in the Bible as Knopf or Mopf. And this one, it gets very, very fine in the details. You can see along the bottom edge, right down here, as we're going from the right side of the ruler to the left, you can see these little itty bitty tiny lines, and these are measurement lines. They were very, very precise in their measurements. Technically, from our understanding, at the point of the time that Moses is living at, they're using the Egyptian long cubit. The Egyptian long cubit, 20.6 inches in length. The Hebrew long cubit, which eventually became used because they wanted to make the distinction between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, the Hebrew long cubit was 20.4 inches. We're unclear when the Hebrew long cubit began to be used. They used the Egyptian long cubit for a much greater length of period of time than they would have used the Egyptian long cubit. We can actually trace the units of measurements and when they went from using the one cubit to the other cubit. And it's very interesting because the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, several other cultures throughout the world all started with a long cubit and went to a short cubit. And a long cubit is much longer. It is measured by the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. So if I were to hold up a long cubit next to my, and it's so long it won't even fit on the computer screen, but if I were to hold up a long cubit and I were to hold it against the bottom of my elbow as if I was leaning on a table, which I am here. So if I'm leaning the cubit on the desk here, and I've got my elbow here, and I am holding up the cubit stick, notice that my middle finger, or any of my fingers for that matter, do not reach the tip of the cubit stick. If I use, however, the short cubit, and I place the short cubit on my desk, and I place my arm there, my arm reaches almost to the tip of the short cubit. So we can consider a cubit, the length from the elbow to the middle finger. This would have been a standard unit of measurement that the average society, if you pulled somebody from society and you said, I need to measure a cubit width, they would be able to measure from the elbow to the tip of the finger. A span was the tip of the thumb to the tip of the pinky finger as the hand is outstretched just as far as you can get it. So from here to here was called a span. And it is, if I hold up my short cubit here, if I place my thumb at the tip of the cubit and I extend my fingers, it just about reaches the span mark, which is exactly half of a cubit. So cubit from elbow to tip of finger, span half of a cubit from the thumb to the pinky finger as they are outstretched, so kind of like the telephone symbol. And then a hand breadth was actually the width of 4 fingers, or from one side of the palm to the other, not including the thumb. And that is approximately 4 inches, which is approximately, my hand is a little smaller than this, but it is approximately the 1/4 of a cubit or half of a span. So that is how they used to measure measurements. Kind of like a foot is a standard 12 inches, but approximately a man's length of his foot. When we are looking at, the average, I'm just under 6 feet in height. Some people are going to be, have much longer arms. Some people are going to have much shorter arms, but on average, the human arm right now is about the 17.5 to 17.6 range. We can trace in 2 Chronicles 3:3, King Solomon has switched the cubits. They're using a cubit of the first measure, but they're interchanging the cubits. So they haven't completely switched over. They're making that distinction. And so they're saying, well, which one are we using? It'd be like, well, are you measuring in yards or are we measuring in meters? Which one are we measuring with? We're using both concurrently. So we've got to make that distinction so that we know exactly which unit we should be looking at. By the time that we get to King Hezekiah, we are looking at 2 Kings 20:20. So King Hezekiah is probably about 200-ish years after King Solomon, about 100 years before Daniel. And King Hezekiah is building a tunnel because the Assyrians are coming to attack Israel and Jerusalem, and he wants to make sure that they have water. So they built a tunnel, and they said that this tunnel is 1,200 cubits. We didn't know what a cubit they were using at the time. Then they found the tunnel, and in the center of the tunnel, it was inscribed. A group started at one end, a group started at the other end. They met in the middle and they said, let's make a plaque. So they made a plaque and said, hey, we've built this tunnel and it is 1,200 cubits in length. So you know where it starts, you know where it ends. We measured it out using today's unit of measurement and divided by 1,200, and that is how we determined that at the time of King Hezekiah, they were using the Hebrew short cubit of 17.5 inches. Ezekiel calls the original cubit, and Ezekiel's living at the time of Daniel, so about 100 years after King Hezekiah. He says that the original cubit is by taking a cubit and a hand breadth. So the 17.5 plus 4.3, 4.5-ish inches. Pardon. So when we are looking at Noah's Ark, we want to determine, okay, Moses is writing to the Israelites. Moses is writing Genesis. In verse 15 says the length 300 cubits, the breadth 50, the height 30. This is not pre-flood cubits. This is a unit of measurement that Moses and his people would have been familiar with. So who knows what unit of measurement they were using before the flood? This has been translated for Moses's people and then for us much, much later on. 300 cubits translates now, because we're using the Royal Egyptian, 515 feet, a width of 85 feet, 10 inches, and a height of 51 feet and 6 inches. So 51 and a half feet. That is big. Just how big, you might ask? Well, this is a replica in Kentucky of the Ark. This is actually shorter and smaller because they used the Hebrew long cubit. And you wouldn't think, okay, well, 20.4 versus 20.6, it doesn't make that much of a difference, but it actually does when you're counting out 300 cubits. So this replica is actually smaller than what Noah's Ark actually would have been. And this is an individual standing in front of it to give you an idea of just how big. Would you have wanted this big object coming at you while there is a monster storm going on and you're in the water? I couldn't imagine this ship coming at you. That is just absolutely tremendous. But if you're more of a visual person and you want to know, okay, well, how does that relate to other ships that I might be familiar with? Here is an example of other ships and the sizes. We've got, it was smaller than the Titanic, but it was larger than the Santa Maria. So if you've gotten a minute to look at that, and you can always go back later on if you want to, screenshot something, or, you want to review it further and see all the, okay, well, how big is this? And let me go take a look and research this ship. There's that for you. So here is a picture of the object in question that we're examining as one of the contenders for the Noah's Ark landing location, this object is exactly 300 Royal Egyptian cubits, or 515 feet in length. So it meets that qualification of being Noah's Ark. So now let's switch to another topic. What did the floor plan look like? Does the Bible tell us? Everything that we need to know is in the scriptures. So let's see. Did it have A, an open floor plan, or B, did it have lots of rooms? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to type in your answer because, this is interactive. I want your opinions. Do you think that the Ark had an open floor plan, or did it have rooms? And do you think that those rooms are mentioned in the Bible? So go ahead and type your answers in there. Gonna give you a minute to think about your answers, and then I'm going to switch the slides and you can see if your answers are correct. So I'll give you the countdown. I see we've got some answers, but get your answer in your mind, and we're going to switch slides in 5, 4, 3, 2. If you said that the Ark had rooms, answer B, then you would be correct. Genesis 6:14 specifically mentions that Noah's Ark would have rooms inside of it. Now, do we know anything about the rooms that would have been inside Noah's Ark? Let's take a look. When they do the ground penetrating radar scans on the site in question, guess what they find? They find right angles, and they find that there are areas that show a denser level than other areas. And by a denser level, I mean that there is an object. There is something under the surface of the earth that the signal is bouncing off of and saying, no, there's a surface here I cannot get past. And it is consistent with, certain measurements, and then there'll be an opening, and then there'll be 90-degree angles and very specific rooms within this feature. And then if you just want to get an idea of where this ground penetrating scan was taken, we can look at the structure and the object in question. And this would be on, if you're looking at the U-shaped mountain over here, Mount Ararat would be to the left of the screen, and pointing up towards the southern area, actually not pointing up, but pointing down towards the southern area, would be on the right side of your screen. But we can see where underneath of the surface there are actually rooms, and each room is different, which, if we're looking at it, this is one idea for a possible floor plan for Noah's Ark, but this shows uniform rooms. And the rooms that we're seeing on the ground penetrating radar are actually varying in size, which would indicate that the rooms were specifically designed for specific animals or for specific purposes as they were building. Because, does a giraffe need the same size space as a rabbit? And I just want you to make note of, the potential stacked cages that they're showing right here along this level that they've removed from the top of this potential model. And there are stacked cages here, and we will be addressing that in one of the future programs on Noah's Ark that we will be doing later this month. Now it's quiz time again. Does the Bible talk about different levels in the Ark? We have mythologies that say, it was a pyramid, there were all sorts of levels, or it was just one big boat, or it was on the back of a turtle and it was one level. So do we actually know how many levels? If you say that it only had 3 levels, that was answer A. If you think, well, maybe it had 4 or more, or, maybe 2 or less, we're going to call that answer B. So think about what type of how many levels it may have had, and we'll see if this is answered within the scripture. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think about that and ponder your choices, get that answer in your mind, and then we can move to the next slide and see what the Bible says about it, if the Bible says anything about this. So we're going to turn the slide in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you said A, you were correct. Genesis 6:16 says, with a lower, a second, and a third story, you should make the ark. And with this object in question, do we see something like this? And the answer is, when we are looking at the GPR scans, we're seeing distinct levels of more open space within the object. So we're seeing potentially an area of, 10.5 feet for an upper level, an area of 15-ish feet for the middle, and then for the bottom a much larger area of 25-ish feet. And this would allow things like birds or spiders and flies and butterflies, things that really don't take up a lot of space, to be on the upper levels, to give more space to the larger and taller animals and people that would have been spending a majority of their time on some of the lower levels. So that is 3 different things that the object in question match with the biblical account. Are there any more? Well, let's look. Windows and doors. Quiz time again. You didn't know you were going to be coming to a pop quiz, did you? So, windows and doors in the ark. Do we think that it had 1 window and 1 door, which is answer A? Or do we suspect, that it had lots and lots of windows and maybe a couple of doors? We're always seeing these pictures of the ark with all of the animals hanging out the side. Is that actually biblical? Do we have an account? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about what answer you're going to choose, and then we can go ahead and change the slide. So we're going to change the slide in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. So when we are looking, we're going to be looking for a 1 window. We're going to be looking for a door, and the door should be in the side. When we look at the object in question, this is what it looks like, and we can see this does not count because this is the area, this area in the upper portion of the boat on the left side of your screen. This is the area that was damaged during that initial expedition to the site. That does not count. There was also some damage over here that on the surface appeared where it may have been an entrance, but ground penetrating radar is not necessarily showing that that's the case, just some damage from throughout the years. But what we are seeing with the ground penetrating radar is something in this general vicinity right here in the lower area of the middle of your screens. And I am going to show you a picture of this. This is the screening that was done, and in the middle of this object in question, there actually is an opening. It is a square, opening that went directly to the middle level of the object in question. It leads to a corridor that goes through the length of the object but does not extend past the object. So it follows the 300 cubit outline. It also has levels within it where there's a ramp that goes up to the upper level and then another ramp that goes down into the lower level. It does not go past the lower level. So with this ground penetrating radar, we are seeing a clear entrance to the middle, no other gigantic openings in the side, and this opening leads to a corridor that has ramp systems that go from one level to another. We do not have a window because the window for Noah's Ark would have actually been most likely on the top of the ship. And we do not see necessarily the top of the ship. That portion does not appear to be on this feature. So, but we can confirm that there is only one opening here. So that meets windows and doors qualification. It meets the length qualification. It meets the level qualification. So we're starting to make some check marks on our checklist. Now let's talk metallurgy. What is metallurgy? Metallurgy is working and the making of various types of metals. As we are looking at metal making, a lot of people are familiar with boats like the Titanic that used a ton of metal. Going back to the Sutton Hoo ship, remember I said this ship would come back into play? A lot of the wood from the ship, the wood itself, there were fragments of it, it rotted away. Some of the other ships actually still had a lot of the wood. When they touched the wood to remove it, it would just disappear, but it did leave an outline of the ship. But you notice all of these little knobs, they almost look like circles. These little circles are actually the nails that were used to hold the ship together. So we know that in the 600s AD, they were using metal. If we go back to Genesis, in our Bible ancestry little chart that we have from Genesis chapter 5, we run across Noah over here as one of the descendants of Seth. But if we look at the descendants of Cain, we go all the way down to one of the last generations that is listed, and this is a man named Tubal-Cain. Now, Tubal-Cain is a very important individual. A lot of people sit there and like, oh, Noah didn't have access to any types of metals. He would have had to use rope or, wooden pegs. But Tubal-Cain, if we look in Genesis chapter 4, he was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. What are brass and iron? Brass and iron are metals, and he is working in these metals on the word artificer. So he is an artificer. That means he is a highly skilled craftsman or inventor. So not just, he's fiddling around with brass and iron and, seeing what he can do. Look, Mom, I made something out of my Play-Doh. No, he is a very skilled craftsman in this, and it's possible that he is the one that is inventing it. And not only is he the one that is inventing it, he is an instructor. He is teaching other people how to work with these metals. And every artificer means that there was more than just one or two. It is a lot of them. So there was a lot of people that were actually working on this metalworking that they have. A lot of people say, well, there was no such thing as iron back in that day. It didn't exist until the Iron Age. Well, I don't necessarily believe that, and I don't necessarily believe that because of something that we read in Judges. In Judges 119, the Israelites are going into the land of Canaan, and they're trying to, take over the land, do what God had said, but they couldn't drive out the inhabitants because the people in that valley had chariots of iron. Now, if we go back and we use our biblical timeline, the chariots of iron that they cannot, drive the people out is 200 plus years before technically the Iron Age ever began. I don't know about you, but I am not going to use an experimental metal to drive a chariot at 40, 50 miles an hour and use that chariot to go into battle. And I'm certainly not going to make, thousands of chariots out of this iron. So when we're looking at when, iron existed, we're told it existed before the flood. So that totally and completely knocks out the idea of a stone, a bronze, and an iron age. Here's some other examples. In this main picture that we have, this is a Turkish iron dagger. It's dated to, 2500 BC, which is before the flood. I don't think that the dating method is correct on this one, but that is supposedly 1,000 years before they invented the idea of smelting iron. So obviously this iron got smelted before the Iron Age began. The axe head up here on the upper right of the screen, from Ugarit. This is in northern Syria. If you were joining us last night, you heard me talk about that location. This iron axe head is supposedly 300 years before the smelting of iron. These are daggers from King Tut's tomb, which again is, 300 years-ish before the invention of iron smelting. So the idea that they couldn't, work with iron, they didn't know how to smelt the iron, is kind of bogus, but their main claim is like, well, these are anomalies because they had, some iron ore, and suddenly they were just walking by a fire and this iron ore dropped into the fire and it accidentally was smelted, and out came these beautiful daggers and axe heads, and it was just a total fluke. Where have we heard a story that is similar to that before? It's back in the book of Exodus, and it involves a man named Aaron, and he had a brother named Moses, and Moses came down off the mountain, and what was Aaron's excuse when they were worshiping the golden calf, and his brother asked him, "What is happening here?" Aaron's excuse was, "Well, I just dropped that gold in that fire and out walked this golden calf." Moses didn't buy that then, and I don't think that we should buy that same excuse when looking at these artifacts. That doesn't really hold a lot of weight. Here are some other very interesting objects. So the London hammer, this is an item that supposedly is 400 million year old limestone. Okay, this is early 1900s, late 1800s style axe head that is embedded inside of the limestone. So either the limestone does not take 400 million years to form, or humans were around a lot earlier than what is even feasibly possible according to the theory of evolution. But this artifact in itself totally disproves all of the theories that they have. And then next to that artifact, we also have an iron pot. This was found in Oklahoma in 1912, and it was a lump of coal that when they opened the lump of coal, now remember, coal is supposedly millions of years old, which is way before the human species ever came into existence, according to their theories. In the middle of the lump of coal is an iron pot. that was embedded inside of it. So again, either humans were around for a lot longer than possible according to their theories, or coal does not take millions and millions of years to form. So with these two artifacts individually, it disproves it. Together, they really disprove the theory of evolution right by themselves. In addition, we've got brass bells that we find embedded in coal that actually really resemble this brass bell was found in Buchanan, West Virginia, but it resembles Hindu bells that are found over near India. So we are finding not just one location, but worldwide cultures that are resembling one another, which also indicates that there was, instead of isolationism, that there is some global trading going back and forth and expeditions that are going throughout the world that are sharing cultures. And I do see a comment from Sheila7221. Says it's worth the trip to Kentucky to see the life-size model. It's an amazing feat. Great example for us to trust God's word. Yes, if you do get a chance and the opportunity to go see that, just standing next to it gives you an awe-inspiring feeling because it's so huge. You can't imagine just how big. And when you go inside of that replica, it is absolutely ginormous. You do not understand how big it was. You can sit there all day long and say, well, this is, 6 feet and 12 feet and 25 feet, and they could have walked through here, and this is how the lightning would have worked. And you just don't get that same notion of understanding until you actually go there and you're like, this is huge. It's exhausting to walk, all the way from one end to the other, and imagine them having to continually do that every day to take care of the animals or, just to get their exercise. Can you imagine being trapped on something? It might look big at one point, but if you're trapped on there for an entire year, even though it's so huge, it can start to feel like the walls might be caving in. So yes, it's not entirely 100% accurate, but I do say, if you have the opportunity, yeah, go see it. It's definitely worth it. All right, getting back to our maps. So the area in question, which from this point I am going to start calling the Noah's Ark site, because it matches so many of the biblical checklists that we're looking at. So I'm just going to call this the Noah's Ark site from this point out. If we are looking at the map from where the Noah's Ark site is, from where Mount Ararat is, if you're looking in the middle near where this big yellow arrow is on your screens, that's Mount Ararat Greater, halfway through. And then as we continue traveling north, directly north it's less than 50 miles. It's a place called Metsamor. And Metsamor is at the edge of a big valley. And we read later that they left the area of Noah's Ark and they traveled from the east to the west to where they would build the Tower of Babel. And it's likely that it is within this valley region, this very fertile region, where the first inhabitants began setting up all of their cities. Metsamor was known for their metals. They had one of the best metal processing places in the ancient world. And if you wanted good metals, everybody was sending to Metsamor for this. And then this location, Taisheba, if we go directly east from Metsamor, Taisheba, which is the now capital of Armenia, it is home of the ancient weather god. And we have multiple people within the generations, the Table of Nations that we were talking about several times in the past week, these 70 men, there are multiple people that are named Sheba. So they would name their towns after either their sons or themselves or, you know, relatives. So it's more than likely that one of these potential Shebas that are listed was actually the Sheba that settled this particular location, and they associated it with this god, Tai Sheba, who is the weather god or the god of storms. Now, I wonder why the god of storms would be located in the general vicinity of the Ararat region. All right, so all of this points back to the fact that metal was available to Noah. And not just, let me try it. It was a metalworking shop. They were making metals all over the place. They were very, very good at it. And they had invented everything that they could possibly need. When you are looking at the Noah's Ark location, there is metal. There is metals that appear to have been molded and that are parts of washers. These are rivets and washers that, when you're using a metal detector, will give a signal saying, hey, there is metal here. And you can see where they actually would have used their tools to, make the imprint here, and then they would hold the metal there, and then they would use a hammer to insert the metal rods that would go through as part of their rivet system. Here is one in sight that has not been removed. This one has been removed. These, everybody has, heard of, if you've been researching this location, everybody's heard that they, went through and they did analysis of these, and a lot of geologists have said, oh no, it's just natural formations. This is not anything that is unique. It's all over this area. Well, that's actually incorrect. When they do these scans, they test inside of the feature and they test outside of the feature. And with the ground penetrating radar, with the metal detectors, the only time that you get results is when you're looking within the feature itself. The metal has been tested, so it does come back iron. There is a lot of iron there, but there's also something very interesting. Within the iron, there is also aluminum and titanium. Titanium can be alloyed with iron and aluminum, and it is used to produce a strong, very lightweight alloy, which you would want necessarily lighter weight materials because the wood in itself is already heavy. We're going to have a large load, and we don't want to weight down the ship too much. Aluminum rarely occurs in nature in its pure form, and this is a pure form of aluminum. Titanium does not occur naturally. It has to be extracted from other minerals in this form, and both of them together within the iron means that this is beyond a shadow of a doubt iron rivets that have been humanly processed. These have actually had a human process that has been performed on them. I see another comment. It says, if there wasn't a worldwide flood, there wouldn't be an explanation for these old artifacts. Correct. Totally agreed with that one. There is not an explanation for these because this is a ship formation that is miles and miles and miles from any water source. It's high in the mountains. If I'm going to build a 515-foot long ship, I am not going to build it in the middle of a desert or in the middle of a steep mountain range. I'm going to build it near a water source, and not just any water source. I want to make sure that it is a very large water source that is large enough to handle a ship that is that large. So going back to our rivets, back in the 70s and 80s, They went through, they did metal detecting over the entire site. This is images of them doing these metal detectors, and they would drag the detector along the surface, the ground surface, and as they're dragging the metal detectors over the ground surface, every so often there's a notation that there is metal feature, so they would put down rocks whenever the metal detector would give them a reading for a metal feature. And they started attaching strings and ribbons to these rock formations so that it's easier to locate and see them at a glance. And here is a photo that shows all of the all of the rocks that are for the metal detector readings, along with the ribbons that connect them. And you can actually see where there are clearly defined lines that run the length of the ship. It is uniform. And if you know a lot about natural formations, you're not really going to see a lot of uniformity. It's going to be more chaotic than uniform. And this is extremely uniform. Now, I do want to point out that from this area, go back, from this area, if you go directly across to this area, so from one side of the formation to the other, that is exactly 50 cubits in length. But notice here how we start to see a slide and the lines are no longer straight. They are bent and curved, pointing towards the right side of the screen. That is because, as I mentioned last week, when they were doing the ground penetrating radar scans, this entire section, so starting from this point over, you can actually see the line going right through where this center individual in the red shirt is sitting, coming down and then coming back over. That entire portion has actually separated underground and is sitting apart from the main body of the ship itself. So it's still there. It has slid to the side some. It's still mostly intact, but it has completely separated. So if they were going to do excavations, you would quickly find that this portion, which is noted here, has actually slid sideways, which gives some of the measurements for the back half of the ship a much wider measurement. But it's not because it's a wider portion of the ship. It is because that portion has simply tilted sideways, and so it gives the appearance of being wider when it actually is not. This is a portion from the side of the feature of Noah's Ark. When you are looking at this, you can see where the ribs of the ship would have been. These are freshly exposed to the air. So when they are freshly exposed, you can see a tremendous discoloration. It is very obvious, but it very quickly will fade to meet the coloration of the dirt and the soil next to it because it's now been exposed to the air. So if you're going to go visit this location and you're like, oh, well, I can't see those rib timbers like that, it's because this is freshly exposed, whereas, right now nobody is freshly, digging along the side. And so it's now been subject to the air and the weather in that general vicinity. If somebody says, oh, well, they haven't been able to replicate these results, this is ground penetrating radar scans that were done back in 2021. So they basically did the same exact scans from back in the 70s and 80s. The equipment has been upgraded slightly, but this is the same exact scans. They went through the entire object. This is from the Turkish government. They did ERT is what they call it, ERT scanning. They performed this in October through November. And the History Channel at one point actually joined the team to do some filming while they were actually examining this and performing this. They call it electrical resistivity tomography. But it's the same thing that they were doing back in the 70s and 80s. And to do this, they would drill in these poles. They would hook up electrical equipment to get a charge running through the soil, and then they would run the machines over the soil to see if they could get a result. And they came up with the same results that were there from the 70s and the 80s. Hi, Jessica. Thank you for joining. We are talking about today all of the different archaeological evidences that are found at the Durupinar Site in, the Durupinar Site in Turkey. And we can actually see Mount Ararat Greater and Mount Ararat Lesser on the screen now. We've gone over so far just a checklist, all of the ways in which this vessel meets the biblical description. So we've checked off the levels, it matches that, the size, the entryways, and the metalworking possibilities for it. We're now getting ready to go into what is gopher wood. So here's a question for everybody. Is gopher wood that has been cut by a gopher, which is A, or is it wood that is kind of like a plywood and has been processed? So I'm going to give you guys a couple of moments to decide whether or not you think it's A, wood that has been cut by a gopher, or B, wood that has been processed more like plywood. All right, I hope you've got your answers ready. So if you said B, you are correct. So gopher wood actually isn't a type of wood. Some of the traditions say that the ark was built out of wood that was like cypress wood. But when they actually we're at the dedication, the Turkish government has recognized this site since the 1980s as the official Noah's Ark location. They made it a national park in Turkey. And at the dedication of the visitor center of the national park, one of the government officials wanted a demonstration for just to see, how can we tell what's under the ground. So they did a demonstration, and as they were doing the demonstration, this piece of wood showed up, and this is the only official excavation that has ever been allowed at the site. But he said, I want you to dig here. So they dug down just a little bit, and it was pretty close to the surface. They dug up this piece, and the government official said, you may take this. So they took it, and they brought it back to America, and they did they cut some slices off of it so that they could investigate what this piece of wood was. Has it been petrified? How was it processed? It was determined that there were 6 layers that were holding it together. So one layer would be processed with a coating. So it says that they pitched it. Doesn't mean the exact same thing. There was a coating that was made out of iron and titanium and aluminum, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, a bunch of chemicals. It was coated. Then another layer was added to it. There was tacks. If you look, we can see little tacks that would hold the layers together, along with the glue that was holding it together. That layer would be processed, and there's at least 6 layers that would do this. And then that brings us to pitching it within and without. So pitch, we have been told that pitch is an asphalt or tar. And, you can see this if you go to the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. We are very familiar with the tar pits that are in the area near Israel. And we see this in the story of some of the stuff that happened right before Sodom and Gomorrah. But let me ask you a question. If tar and asphalt are the result of the flood, because this is made from the compression, it's the same way that coal is formed. Coal is formed because of water and pressure and decaying organic matter. You add a little bit of heat and put it under pressure, and it turns to coal. Coal is more of a result of land dwelling, whereas tar and asphalt and oil are more the result of sea creature dwellings. But this is all a result of the flood. So how could Noah use pitch as tar and asphalt, definition of pitch, before the flood happened to coat the boat? You can't use something that doesn't exist yet. So what exactly was the pitch that Noah used? If you look at the word is actually not the same word pitch that is used throughout the rest of Scripture. It is a totally different word in the Hebrew, and it's the only place that it is used. And it actually is more of an item that would be tree-based resin. We still use this today to prevent rust and decay because of high salt and acidic contents. It forms a very strong bond, which is great for boats for the salt and acid, but it's also great for airplanes, and we use it in bulletproof vests. We see this in natural resins like amber and frankincense. So the pitch that Noah is using, in addition to this type of glue that they were putting over top of each layer, and here's more of pictures of the different layers that they're looking at, and here's a close-up of the little nails that were used to hold these layers together. Here's an image down here in the lower left-hand corner of the full piece of wood that had been pulled out of this site. This pitch actually would have worked so that it protected the ship from decay in the acidic waters, because the waters would have been very, very acidic, not only from the decaying organic matter that was there, but also from all of the volcanic activity that was going on during the time of the flood. It also had the potential to become electrified, because where's the one place that you're told not to be in a thunderstorm? You're told don't be in water and don't be near a tree. And here the people on the ark, and they're in the middle of water, and they're on a wooden vessel. One strike and it's like, okay, no more ark. So this pitch actually would have protected it and shielded it during these lightning strikes. It would have acted as an insulator. It would have shielded it during all of these debris impacts. That's why it is now used for things like bulletproof glass and vests. So the pitch is a much different representation of pitch than how it's typically been presented. And then just quickly want to go over one more thing before we close out for the evening. I know we've gone just over an hour. And that would be a cross section, and how Noah's Ark and a desiccator are similar. So I was looking through some textbooks, and I came across cross section of a desiccator. I'm like, oh, that looks very familiar. It almost looks like a cross section of the ark. And you will recall that I said nobody has done any excavations of Noah's Ark. Now, they haven't done any excavations, but they have put down cameras and have been able to investigate on the inside and to see what's near the bottom of the vessel. And they have come back with traces of silica. And some people have determined that this silica was part of the sludge. It was a leftover byproduct from making of the rivets, which it very well could have been. But why would they have included the sludge? Why would they have not gotten rid of that while they were making the ark? Because this is a vessel where every square inch mattered. I don't think they would have just left that for a specific reason. Now, if you are familiar with a desiccator is something that is used in scientific experiments. You would use a something like silica, and it's a desiccant. In the desiccator, it's at the bottom. In the Noah's Ark site, it's in the bottom. The desiccator is then sealed. In Noah's Ark, God then sealed them in. So the ark was sealed, desiccator is sealed. There is a desiccant in both. There is life in both. What do we see desiccators used for today? Today, desiccators are used for AC systems in chemical hauling. We use it for radio broadcasting and scientific research. It works for the dehumidification process and for air supply and flow. So there's all sorts of uses that we have today. What could they have possibly used it for in Noah's Ark? Well, first thing, temperature control. You're on a vessel, it's either going to get super, super hot because of all of the life forms that are breathing and they're creating, body heat. But then it was also going to be very, very cold because we have a lot of water and shifting because of all of the elements of the flood. So we're going to have some temperature control issues, but that also means that we're going to have some humidity issues. So as a giant desiccator, this would have actually been designed to reduce the humidity within the vessel. And one of the other big problems, if you have too much humidity, your food supplies can be exposed to the excess moisture. A desiccator would take care of that. It would absorb all of that excess moisture, which would prevent mold and algae growth within not only your food and your water sources, but also you don't want that to get into your lungs or to affect your health in any way. Same thing with the animals. You don't want them to be exposed to this. So it would control a mold and algae growth. And also they're restarting the world. So any chemicals or any type of technological devices that they would have, brought with them to make, rivets in the future, they were going to have to carry that on board the vessel. So they would need something to make sure that they could safely do that. And as a desiccator, this ship was designed to allow them to be able to safely do that. So that is just one of the interesting things that I have found about Noah's Ark and how technologically advanced it actually was. It wasn't just a hick farmer throwing together a little fishing boat for a weekend. This was something that was very highly thought out, and it did its job. So we are going to close for this evening. If anybody has any last minute questions they want to throw up there, while I give you a brief overview, next week we're going to talk about where we've talked about the Ark itself. We're going to talk about, the different life forms that the Ark carried inside of it. We're going to talk about some of the anthropological findings and archaeological findings in the general vicinity that, show evidence for the Ark being there. So we are going to talk about that next week. If you have any questions, after the program, use our Ask the Archaeologist form on our website. You can comment on this video or any video of ours on YouTube. You can also contact us through Facebook. And I just want to wish you all a happy evening and a great rest of your next week. Thank you for joining us.